Hello, my name is Eduardo Guerra, and I'm here to present you this paper, an exploratory study about non-functional requirements documentation practices in Agile teams. I would like to highlight that recognize Sharar Nazir, Luciana Zaina, and Jorge Melegatti also as authors of this paper. So, our starting point comes from the fact that mostly agile documents and artifacts are mainly created to support functional requirements, right? In agile, we have this idea that we need to uh, prioritize the requirements from the users, right? Use a light documentation and try to rely more on communication, right? So most of the artifacts we have, like user stories, epics, and other things, like, for example, the acceptance criteria are always kind of related to these more functional requirements from the user, right? So, what about the non-functional requirements, right? Currently we have a lack of these agile approaches for non-functional requirements, right? So, some of the things we find is, for example, prioritization issues, right? Especially because usually, let's say, the user, the product owner is the boss, and sometimes he looks more from the functional point of view. But what kind of non-functional requirements can be relevant, right? However, if we search outside Agile for approaches for documenting these non-functional requirements, the point is maybe we can end up with a lot of documentation and lose a little bit of our agility, right? And what kind of happen is that the companies, without getting the methodological support from Agile for documenting these requirements, tries to have some tailor some techniques or maybe pick up some ideas and try to adapt a little bit. And we don't have a solution that kind of fits all the companies, right? They find themselves without much guidance, right? So, okay, is that true? What is the actual situation, right? So, in this study, we take a look in how companies that adopt an agile process are handling their non-functional requirements, especially from the documentation point of view. So I'm going to explain, but the idea is to go into the companies, we talk to people, and we take a look on their documentation to try to get more evidence on this direction, right? So our goal is to explore what some companies are doing. So our goal is not to get like an overall view of the whole industry. We are going to look in a few companies, right? And one of the goals we have is to identify some emerging techniques. So some solutions that they are using and it is working for them, right? So let's say it's not, our claim is not that everybody uses these techniques, but the idea by finding these techniques is that can be a starting point or even a reference for other agile teams. Okay, so we have these research questions, how the Agile team describe their work with non-functional requirements, what kind of documentation they adopt, what kinds of non-functional requirements they usually document, if there is any different, and what practices, what these emerging practices we can find in these companies, right? So, in our research process, first of all, we invited companies. Of course, um, they need to adopt an agile method because that was in one of our goals, right? To investigate these in the context of agile teams, right? So, in this case, from the companies we invited, we three accepted the invitation, three very different companies. So we did an interview with one member of this team, and this interview was to understand how they handle the non-functional requirements and where we can look for them. After that, based on the access they gave us, we did some document inspection and finally analyzed the data. In our interview, first we start with some contextual questions to understand kind of the whole agile process, to confirm if they are actually agile. And then we did some requirements engineering questions to understand how they manage the requirements. And finally, we did some questions more focused on the non-functional requirements documentations, how they document, where they look for it. And the document inspection, let's say, went according to what the access the company gave to us. So in some case, we have access to platform like Jira, Trello, or to some files they use like Excel, Word files, right? The access for some companies was supervised, so we browsed their documentation with some kind of surveillance. In some cases, they just gave us the access, and we are independent to explore. And the type of artifacts we inspected was, for instance, in some cases, agile artifacts like the user story, epics, etc. And in other cases, some other documents like checklists, guidelines, uh, uh, all based on, uh, let's say, the approach that the company tell us in the interview, and of course, the access they gave us. Okay, so a general overview. So we have company A, B, and C, right? We found in this inspection a total of 283 non-functional requirements. The document that has more was these UX guidelines, and the most frequent type was usability, right? So I will give a fast view from the companies. So this is company A, it's a small startup. In their documentation, we found 49 non-functional requirements. The most frequent was usability, but as you can see, we also have a significant amount as security and also performance. Company B was a joint stock company, has over 20 years in the software development market. Um, uh, we only have access to part of its documentation. The most frequent type of non-functional requirement was security for this company. That was very important. But as you can see, we also have a significant amount of usability. And company C was a dedicated branch for a large company that and this branch deals with digital signage. And in this case, as you can see, that's a much more usability, and we even have a UX UI guidelines document that is dedicated to that. Right. So going to what the most interesting part is to get some insights we have based on the research questions. So we find out that in the interviews that they mention, in some cases they prefer some face-to-face communication, especially when the teams are small, instead of explicitly documenting these non-functional requirements. And one thing that we find out is that they don't have a well-defined procedure like some company guideline. This is how we deal with non-functional requirements. And actually the teams kind of choose what is more suitable to them. About the kind of documentation, we find out that They customized the existing templates like for epics, and some of them use the acceptance criteria as a way to add some requirements, non-functional, like some quality constraints. And also some of them, when a non-functional requirement it's important, they have some dedicated documents, and also they mention some automated inspection tools, not only for verification but also as a way to formally define these requirements, right? So as an approach to say, okay, I don't need to write this if it's in my tool, right? So which kind of non-functional requirements they document? We find out that usability is the most commonly documented in these companies, of course. And I think based on the conversation, we could see that because this is something that's very visible for the client, so for end users, so that come up in conversation and meetings. We also saw that the attention that each team spend with some different non-functional requirement would depend on the project. And in the case they have a particular focus, they will, let's say, give more attention on how they document. So it's not like all non-functional requirements should be like this. It's like, for me, security is important, so I will focus on documenting more these kind of non-functional requirements. Okay, so the fourth research question was about the practices. We find these 5 emerging practices, and I will go through them a little bit fast. So the first one was dedicated documents. So when something is important, pick up and create a document dedicated to that, so the team can give more attention and focus on this. The drawback is because usually these documents, the ones we found, were big documents, and we are not sure that everyone in the team actually read these big documents. Another one is user story labeling. So they put labels on user stories to connect them to some non-functional requirements. We recognize that that has a limited expressiveness. So not everything we can express easily this way, but in another hand, it's easy to search and locate user stories that is connected to that requirement. Tasks and acceptance criteria, the idea is to use what the user stories already have, like defining a task or defining an acceptance criteria related to a non-functional requirement. A drawback of this is that in this case, if you need the same requirement, for example, for performance in many user stories, you need to repeat that in all of them. User story subsections, we also found a team that created, because these tools has some flexible templates, and they might add some new sessions in user stories, right? So this case, you encourage the team to pay attention. However, we need to be careful because that can harm a little bit let's say the user story is supposed to be short, and then if we start adding a lot of subsection, then they can end up really large, right? And finally, this one I found very interesting is because we do have some automation tools that can do some verification, but the team also see that as a way to specify these requirements. So instead of actually writing a document or something like inside a user story, okay, we have an automated tool that can verify this, so let's use this tool also to define these requirements. So I found this one especially really interesting, that's also used for requirement definition. And I think the 2 biggest contributions in this work was first to bring this evidence of this lack of guidance and support that these Agile teams, the Agile process has with non-functional requirements. We saw that it's like, okay, we don't have a guidance, so we do our way. And also, these emerging solutions can also be used by other teams and serve as a guide, right? So Thank you very much for your attention, and please feel free to get in touch in case you have any doubt. Thank you very much.